The Young and the Restless Spoilers. When the doctors finally announced that Noah would have his bandages removed, the entire Newman family gathered in a storm of anticipation and quiet fear. The long weeks of uncertainty had built a pressure no one could name. For Nick and Sharon, every sleepless night had been haunted by one single hope, that when the gauze came off, they would see the same familiar face, bruised perhaps, scarred maybe, but still their son. The sterile smell of the hospital mixed with the sterile silence that often preceded heartbreak. Sharon stood close to Nick, her fingers clasped together tightly, trembling in a rhythm of disbelief. But when the final layer of the white cloth slipped from the man's skin, an unspoken horror swept across the room. The face that emerged was not Noah's. The cheekbones were wrong. The eyes too dark, the jawline unfamiliar, the expression distant and alien. For a moment, it was as if time froze, no one breathed, no one spoke. Nick's confusion shifted to fury, and Sharon's lips parted in a silent gasp that shattered her strength. The man lying before them blinked with innocent confusion, asking for recognition from the people whose hearts had just been torn apart. Yet all they could see was a stranger who wore their son's name. The doctor's words came out flat, clinical, and almost rehearsed. He explained that the accident had caused catastrophic damage, that Noah's face had to be reconstructed using advanced grafting, that identity in such cases could feel disorienting to family members. But none of this made sense. Sharon's intuition screamed something darker, not disfigurement, not surgical alteration, but substitution. The man's mannerisms, the way his eyes darted around the room, the cold detachment in his tone, all were wrong. There was no trace of Noah's warmth, his familiar nervous smile, his quiet compassion. What lay in the bed was a body animated by someone else's history. Nick demanded records, scans, photos, proof, anything to make this madness stop, but the hospital's files were incomplete, sections redacted, signatures missing. It was as though the identity of this man had been rewritten overnight. As the hours passed, the sense of dread deepened. Sharon revisited the night of the accident in her mind, the screech of tires, the distorted police reports, the unexplained delay between the crash and the hospital call. Something had gone wrong long before they arrived that night. Perhaps Noah had never been brought here. Perhaps the person in this room had taken his place long before the ambulance even reached the ER. The more she thought, the more the timeline fractured. The attending surgeon, Dr. Marks, avoided their eyes when questioned, and his voice trembled in subtle guilt each time he said the word reconstruction. A storm was brewing behind the walls of that hospital, a secret too big to contain. Nick, torn between rage and despair, contacted the police, demanding an immediate investigation. But bureaucracy was slow, and while he waited, the stranger who wore Noah's name began to act as though he belonged. He began recalling moments that had never happened, conversations that never existed, places Noah had never been, and childhood details twisted into eerie fragments of false memory. Sharon felt herself unraveling under the weight of it. She started to doubt her own mind, wondering if trauma had warped her perception, if maybe, somehow, her love for Noah had blinded her to what was now his new face. But then she saw the eyes again, hollow, distant, observant in a way that felt predatory. This was no broken man recovering from surgery. This was someone studying them, adapting, mimicking, learning their family's rhythm like a parasite wearing human skin. As days turned into nights, a series of inconsistencies began to emerge. Noah's old medical file showed a rare childhood scar behind his right ear, the stranger had none. The dental records didn't match. His fingerprints had been conveniently lost due to tissue damage. The police's attempt to verify DNA was met with another dead end when the hospital claimed the original samples were contaminated. Nick's instincts as a father screamed the truth that no one wanted to hear: the man in that bed was not their son. Sharon, too, could no longer silence the dread that had taken root in her chest. Every glance at that unfamiliar face was like staring into a void pretending to be love. Rumors began to ripple through Genoa City. Some whispered that the real Noah had been abducted, others believed he had died and the hospital had covered it up to avoid scandal. Victor Newman moved quietly behind the scenes, using his vast network to uncover the truth. He discovered inconsistencies in the hospital's recent financial records, unmarked payments from an anonymous source just days before the crash. The same surgeon who operated on Noah had a hidden history of experimental identity procedures overseas, programs funded by unknown benefactors. Something far larger than a simple accident was unfolding. The Newmans were not victims of tragedy but pawns in a cold, calculated game. The man in the hospital bed began to walk again, his recovery rapid, unnatural. His speech patterns grew more confident, his tone more assertive. It was as though the stranger had finished studying Noah's life and now believed himself to be him. He spoke to Sharon as if recalling deep memories, quoting private family moments that no outsider could possibly know. That terrified her more than anything. Someone had given him access to intimate details, journals, photos, conversations, as if he had been prepared to replace Noah long before the accident occurred. When she confronted the medical staff, she found surveillance footage mysteriously missing, nurses reassigned, and files erased. Even the hospital administrator resigned overnight without explanation. Nick's breaking point came when the police returned their findings. The DNA did not match Noah's. The hospital tried to dismiss it as a lab error, but there were no more excuses left to hide behind. The truth was brutal: the man who stood before them was an imposter. Yet even in the face of undeniable evidence, the stranger smiled, calm and unshaken, and said that he was Noah, that the accident had simply changed him. The chilling composure in his words froze Sharon's blood. It wasn't just a lie, it was a performance so complete that it bordered on delusion. Behind the walls of Newman Enterprises, Victor began connecting the dots. A shadow organization had been targeting families of influence across several states, replacing heirs with surgically altered doubles to infiltrate corporations from within. Noah's accident was not random, it was a deliberate act of identity theft. Somewhere, the real Noah was either imprisoned or dead, and this new face was part of a conspiracy aimed at dismantling the Newmans from the inside. Every move the imposter made seemed to align with strategic interests: attending meetings Noah was never meant to, signing documents, accessing sensitive files. The nightmare was no longer personal. It was political, financial, and possibly lethal. Sharon began to deteriorate emotionally, unable to distinguish between truth and deception. Her maternal instinct screamed one thing while the evidence screamed another. She started hearing Noah's voice in her dreams, calling for help, trapped somewhere unseen. Each dream felt more vivid, more urgent, as if her subconscious had connected to him through the bond only a mother could have. Meanwhile, Nick grew colder, more methodical. He began tracking phone records, digging into ambulance logs, uncovering a disturbing fact: there had been 2 crash victims that night, not one. One had been declared dead at the scene but never identified. That body was missing from the morgue. It was then that Nick realized the cruelest truth: the person they buried under Noah's name might not have been him either. The family stood at the crossroads of madness and revelation. Every answer led to deeper confusion, every discovery pointed to manipulation. The man who called himself Noah began to win over others, convincing acquaintances and friends through charm and emotional intelligence. He was rewriting Noah's story in real time, turning reality into fiction. Sharon's pleas fell on deaf ears. Everyone wanted to believe the miracle of survival, not the horror of replacement. It was only when Faith, Noah's sister, returned home and met the stranger that the illusion cracked. Her instinctive recoil, her refusal to call him brother, reignited the family's resistance. As winter crept into Genoa City, the walls around the truth began to crumble. Victor's investigator discovered a private clinic overseas where patients underwent facial reconfiguration under coded identities. The payments traced back to a shell corporation linked to a rival family, one with a long vendetta against the Newmans. The pieces fit too perfectly. Noah had been taken because he was the key to something bigger, perhaps a corporate espionage network, perhaps a personal revenge disguised as science. Whatever the motive, the result was monstrous: a stolen face, a stolen name, a stolen life. In the final, unbearable revelation, Sharon visited the stranger one last time. His eyes softened, and for a fleeting second, she saw something, a flash of recognition, a familiar tremor, as if Noah's essence lingered somewhere deep inside that alien shell. It broke her completely. She realized that the line between truth and illusion had blurred beyond recovery. Maybe the mind could be rewritten. Maybe the soul could be erased and replaced. The question no one could answer was terrifying. If this man truly believed he was Noah, if every memory had been implanted so perfectly that even he couldn't tell the difference, then who was he now? And more importantly, where was the real one, or had he ever existed at all? The hospital lights flickered that night as if mocking the fragility of truth. Outside, snow began to fall softly over Genoa City, covering every trace of the nightmare that had unfolded. But for Nick and Sharon, there would be no peace, only the unbearable knowledge that the face they saw was a stranger's, and the chilling possibility that somewhere out there, Noah was still alive, staring through another mask, waiting to be found. Nick and Sharon had always sensed something was off, a quiet tremor beneath the relief that everyone else seemed to feel when the doctors had said Noah had survived. There were moments, fleeting, imperceptible seconds, when the silence in that hospital room felt heavier than grief. The man on the bed, with a face not theirs, had been a question that no one wanted to ask aloud. But today, that question turned into an unbearable truth. They stood before him as he stared back, bewildered, eyes filled with confusion and fear that might have been real, or perfectly rehearsed. Nick's voice cracked as he demanded to know who this man was, what he was doing behind the wheel of Noah's car, why his son's name had been attached to a stranger's life. The man's lips trembled as he said he couldn't remember anything, that the crash had erased his past, that the name Noah Newman was all the hospital ever called him. The explanation felt thin, fabricated, soulless. Sharon's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs as if trying to warn her, this wasn't trauma. This was theater. The confusion spread like a virus. Nurses whispered behind closed doors. The attending physician's eyes darted toward the hallway every time Nick raised his voice. The police report had listed the victim as Noah, but the identification had been made only through the car registration and wallet found at the scene. What if the wallet had been planted? What if the man who truly owned that face had never been in the car at all? Nick felt a chill crawl down his spine as the reality began to fracture into unanswerable questions. The stranger's memory loss made everything worse. Every time Sharon asked something, his favorite food, his friends, his last memory, he stared blankly, as if listening to stories about a life he'd never lived. There was no recognition, no emotion, no echo of their son. It was as though someone had wiped a human being clean and inserted him into their world like an experiment gone wrong. Nick decided he could no longer waste another moment trapped in that hospital's suffocating air. He left Sharon to watch the imposter while he began his own search, retracing Noah's last known steps. Calls went unanswered, credit cards untouched, social media silent. His son had vanished completely from the world. It was as if the moment the crash occurred, the real Noah had been erased, not just from the physical world but from every digital trace of his existence. He checked the GPS of Noah's car. The coordinates made no sense, a path leading far out of Los Angeles, into a remote industrial area with no known connection to his son's life. When Nick contacted the police, the case file had already been sealed for ongoing investigation. That was impossible. No case should be sealed unless there was an active threat or a political order behind it. Something was being hidden. Meanwhile, Sharon grew increasingly disturbed by the man in the hospital bed. He began to mimic Noah's gestures unconsciously, the way he once brushed his hair back, the soft way he smiled when embarrassed. But it wasn't natural, it was mechanical, rehearsed, studied. Someone had shown him who Noah was, trained him to be convincing. The longer she watched, the more she became convinced this wasn't amnesia. It was a cover story, a way to buy time until someone decided what to do next. When she told Nick about her fears, he agreed instantly. They had been parents long enough to know when a soul was missing from their child's eyes. What lay in that bed was a body, not a son. Nick pushed his investigation further, calling everyone Noah had spoken to before the crash. Friends in Los Angeles hadn't heard from him in weeks. The art studio where he worked said he'd left early that night, heading somewhere urgent. His girlfriend's voicemail was full, her messages unread. The trail grew colder with each call. The idea that Noah might be alive, wandering somewhere with memory loss, kept Nick from falling apart completely. He clung to that possibility like a prayer. Maybe Noah had walked away from the accident scene dazed, confused, hiding until he remembered who he was. Maybe he was somewhere safe, waiting for them to find him. But even as he convinced himself of that, another darker thought gnawed at him. If the man in the hospital wasn't Noah, then what had really happened to his son? By the third day, the hospital became a fortress of denial. Administrators refused to release records, citing privacy and legal constraints. The stranger's medical file listed him as Noah Newman, age, height, and blood type all perfectly aligned with Noah's, but no one could verify the source. The attending surgeon had abruptly taken leave, and his office had been cleared overnight. Sharon began receiving anonymous text messages, "Stop asking questions." Each message came from a different number. Fear turned into fury. She knew now that they were not dealing with a medical mystery but a human conspiracy. Someone wanted them to believe in this fake Noah because the truth, whatever it was, would destroy more than one life. Then came the rumor, the one that spread like wildfire across Genoa City and Los Angeles. It started as a whisper in a nurse's break room, then appeared in the tabloids: Noah Newman confirmed dead. The article claimed a secondary body from the crash had been identified as Noah based on unverified dental records. The hospital refused to comment, the police refused to confirm, and yet the rumor persisted. Sharon nearly collapsed when she saw it. Nick tore the newspaper to shreds, but the words had already burned themselves into their minds. If Noah was dead, who was the man pretending to be him? And who wanted them to believe otherwise? Nick's instincts turned obsessive. He began piecing together every inconsistency: the call that came from an untraceable number the night of the crash, the ambulance logs showing an unexplained stop, the missing footage from the highway cameras. Someone had engineered the entire event. He met with Victor in secret, knowing his father's resources could uncover what law enforcement refused to. Victor's expression was grave when Nick told him everything. There was something ancient and cold in his eyes, the look of a man who had seen too many schemes and knew this one was personal. He promised to find out who was behind it, but warned Nick that when the truth came out, it would change everything they knew about their family. Back at the hospital, the stranger's behavior began to shift. He no longer appeared confused or scared. His posture straightened, his tone sharpened. He began asking questions about the Newman Enterprises board, about family investments, about Victor's health. He spoke like a man who had a purpose now, and it wasn't recovery, it was infiltration. Sharon started recording his words secretly, sending them to Nick. Each day, the recordings grew stranger, his voice colder, more assured. He wasn't Noah, he was someone becoming Noah, learning the role as though preparing for a takeover. Nick's worst fear crystallized when Victor's investigator returned with partial information. There had been 2 accident reports filed that night, 2 cars, not one. The second had been struck intentionally, the driver dead before the ambulance arrived. The coroner's report was incomplete, the fingerprints missing. When Nick asked for the body, the morgue said it had been transferred to another facility for private handling. The paperwork led to a dead end. The more he searched, the more he realized the tragedy had been staged. Someone wanted them to bury the wrong man and accept a stranger as Noah. The chaos reached its peak when Sharon received an unmarked envelope at her doorstep. Inside was a photograph, grainy, dark, but unmistakable. It was Noah. The real Noah, alive, sitting in what looked like a foreign hospital room, his eyes open but distant, as though sedated. On the back of the photo was a single line written in red ink, "He's not dead. He's ours." Sharon's scream tore through the quiet suburban morning, echoing across the walls of their house. When Nick saw it, he felt something inside him snap. Whoever was behind this had crossed a line beyond forgiveness. Rumors continued to swirl, some claiming Noah had faked his own death, others suggesting corporate rivals had taken him to manipulate Victor. But Sharon knew this wasn't business, it was personal. The stranger in that hospital bed was part of a psychological war designed to break them apart, to make them question their sanity, to force them to accept a reality built on lies. Every time she looked into his unfamiliar eyes, she saw the same calm detachment of someone who knew more than he would ever admit. She began to suspect he wasn't a victim of memory loss at all, but a participant in something much larger, an experiment, perhaps, or a pawn in an identity game run by forces far beyond Genoa City. Days turned into weeks, and the family found themselves living in a nightmare that refused to end. Each clue led to another deception, each revelation only deepened the fog. Was Noah truly alive somewhere, trapped and voiceless? Or was his existence now split, part flesh, part fabrication, both real and unreal? Sharon could no longer sleep without seeing that photograph in her mind, the hollow stare of her son reaching out from an unknown place.